Welcome to the Lean Focus Podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of lean transformation with your host, Damon Baker.
Brian, Envista is a fascinating story. You didn't start from zero, and you were a spinoff from Danaher, which is arguably the gold standard of lean business systems in the world. You had the playbook, you had the tools, you had the people, and yet at some point, the organization drifted. Take us back to that moment, and how does a company that knows lean works stop using it effectively?
Yeah, hi, Damon. First of all, let me give you a little bit of history of Envista. I think that would be a good context into our discussion around where we were headed in terms of kind of coming out of COVID. So if you remember where we started, we came out of a spinoff from Danaher late in 2019, I want to say. We were creating a whole new Envista culture on the dental platform. We brought over our dental, DBS playbook, our tools, and really the people. If you think about that, and that was late in 2019, COVID hit in early 2020. With COVID, we really moved everything into a digital world. Our tools, Kaizens, and really the EBS mindset went all digital. Trainings happened digitally, Kaizens, workshop. We drove productivity and really saved a lot of cash during the initial phases of COVID. So, coming out of COVID, we felt pretty good, right? We had an established track record of strong revenue. We were driving EBITDA growth. The business was growing. The category or the industry was growing. So, things looked pretty bright coming into, 2021 or coming out of 2021. We set that with that, we were setting realistic, and we really delivered against the targets that we had set.
So what does drift look like inside a company that still talks about lean but isn't living it? Like what kind of behaviors would you see?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a drift, right? I mean, for us, we were still doing what we would consider to be standard EBS or Envista Business Systems operations. We were running Kaizens, we were doing PSPs, but I think we were, to a certain extent, kind of, not resting on our laurels, but we were leveraging our Kaizens, or we were spending more time about quantity of Kaizens versus the quality of Kaizens, right? So we spent our time in saying, hey, we want a Kaizen to support this. We want a function to do that. We need PSP. So we were kind of, I would say, more around going through some of the motions versus what were those motions or what were those Kaizens really supposed to drive? They were supposed to drive continuous improvement, whether it's cost savings, revenue growth, and other things associated with what we wanted the business to look like. But it just became more of kind of, I would say, to a certain extent, going through the motions to continue on the EBS journey. Not that every single Kaizen or every single event was doing that, but I think we were a little bit complacent coming out of COVID. And remember what the atmosphere was coming out of COVID, right? We had just gone through one of the, as a company and really in the world, all of the things you saw, all of the challenges with COVID, and we felt pretty good coming out of COVID. So there was a little bit of, I wouldn't call it arrogance, but I think there was just a little bit of, hey, we just got through this big event with, some pretty good results. So I think that in itself kind of started out in terms of, putting the organization of, what's the right term I'm looking for, Damon? Would you say it was more complacency? Maybe it's not complacency, but I think it's much more around kind of being pretty happy with what we came out of COVID with.
So when you're deprioritizing things that should never have been deprioritized, you mentioned EBS as an example. So kind of talk through that. So what replaced the focus on EBS?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. When you think about deprioritizing within a business or a company, I think, a couple of things. One is obviously we're looking for cost savings, right? So one of the things that we looked at in different functions of the business was, hey, did we stop investing in certain areas? Yeah, we did. We stopped investing in our commercial organizations. We stopped investing in our sales and marketing. We stopped investing in R&D and to a certain extent our manufacturing sites. So, the lack of investment probably was one piece that came out of looking at where we want to save money or where we want to focus our attention. The other area I think we looked at was EBS as an example where we stopped thinking about EBS as an enabler to improve our gross margins, EBS as an enabler to improve our revenue side of the business. We stopped utilizing the tools. We stopped utilizing really where we wanted to go and focus more on other areas of the business like cost cutting, right? So, to me, we always had that functionality. We always had that capability. I think we just decided to say, hey, let's focus on these other things because we need some of those savings now versus, improvements to help us get through this tough time or this period of time that we're going through right now.
I think most people, most companies would be in violent agreement with that idea. Despite that, why do so many leadership teams still struggle to narrow down their priorities to the critical few things?
Again, I think it goes back to probably leadership. I think it starts with leadership. And again, myself and our senior leadership team having a clear vision of what we want to do from an Envista perspective, what we want to do from an OpCo perspective, and then from there, those priorities bubble down or bubble up, right? Depending upon how you want to look at it. I think when you have that, and then you have the leadership commitment to execute against those activities. I think, the priorities really do rise to the top. I think the number of priorities basically narrow down. I think when you stop or when you don't have that, I think you come in with a lot of great ideas and a lot of things that need to be solved. But quite frankly, you just can't do it, right? Because it doesn't fit into your strategy if you don't have one. And I think that is, to me, is one of the biggest challenges or one of the biggest things that we've been able to do with the last year and a half is really have a clear strategy, a clear leadership team that focuses on what we want to drive for the next, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, the next 3 years, and the next 5 years, right? So again, I think it's laser focused to me is really what it comes back to as part of that leadership continuum.
You had strong mentorship, leadership alignment, and especially around reinforcing how critical the Envista Business System is to the overall performance of the company. So what changed when leadership made EBS non-negotiable again?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very, very fortunate in my career. I've had some great people that I worked with over time. I think when we had some of our leadership changes in 2025, I think, having that fresh set of eyes coming into the organization. Again, you got to think about some of the leaders that, came into our organization. They were from the standard, Lean Six Sigma world. We were more of the Danaher / business systems world. And we basically, I don't want to say merged the systems, but basically looked at what's best on both sides of that, equation. And we try to make the best of both and make that an Envista Business Systems. When I look at that and we had the freedom to operate within that environment, I think things started to really open up. Now, does that mean that everything is perfect? No, it doesn't mean everything is perfect. What it means is that, we have the freedom and we have the luxury to go make and drive sustainable change. I mean, to me, I think that's the biggest thing is to drive change within this organization that is meaningful and that is impactful for this organization. Was the freedom ever gone? I don't know if it was ever gone. I think it was always there. I think it's just a function of, you have to walk through that door and you have to basically, help the organization get through either tough times or extract and drive during the good times. And using EBS as a not a tool, but it's more of a business system and more of building it into our processes. And when you do that, it comes and becomes part of your everyday life. I think that to me is a thing that I continue to press from an EBS perspective is, it's part of who we are. It's part of what we do. It's not just a separate tool that we work on, right? It's part of our day in and day out lives. And I think that to me is the message that I tell people from anybody who's running a business systems perspective. I think to me, that's one of the biggest enablers of EBS, DBS, however you want to phrase it.
In your view, having lived it, why do you believe lean fails without top leadership commitment at the top?
No, that's a great question, Damon. I mean, I think whether it's lean or whether it's Six Sigma, whether it's strategy, commercial, I think without leadership, most things will fail, right? And leadership, presents itself in a variety of different ways. Leadership could be, hey, we want to set a strategy, we want to, assign resources to that. It could be going to Gemba, leading a Kaizen. It could be a variety of different ways. And leadership shows up in many different formats and different ways across the organization. But without that leadership buy-in and without leadership support, it just becomes another initiative that, quite frankly, is the flavor of the month, and that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to basically leverage what we have as part of our priorities, and then really based upon priorities, drive that execution across the organization. If leadership continues to change what those priorities look like, then you lack leadership, right? So to me, it's ties together of good, strong leadership with good, strong execution. They have to go hand in hand.
Flipping this on the opposite side, what does the opposite behavior look like from a CEO at the top who's not embracing lean and leading with lean? What sort of behaviors have you experienced?
I think most CEOs, and again, I'll talk a little bit about what I do know, which is our CEO. And again, our CEO, Paul, has come from the traditional, Jackwell house of, Lean Six Sigma, which is really project focused, removing, standard deviation, removing variation, and project driven. Versus Larry and Danaher, which is much more around, driving the culture, building a business system, looking at everything holistically. And I think there's great elements of both. And if you think about, the Danaher system, it incorporates lean as part of that. So to me, I think being able to take the benefits of both, which is, the whole holistic business systems perspective, along with the accountability that kind of, quite frankly, Lean Six Sigma drives, is really the best of both worlds. I think, my boss, Paul, he comes from that world. He believes in that world. He knows that continuous improvement never stops. It's part of who you are. It's part of how we are ingrained. And he has embraced that basically from day one, right? And so one of the first things that he did coming into this organization is how do we reset that culture of EBS that we basically had lost for the last, let's call it, year time period? How do we engage? How do we get the associates motivated? How do we leverage EBS and get that message back out to the organization?
You really believe that the turning point was relaunching the EBS. So, and I wouldn't say you guys completely reinvented the system and you didn't create a new framework per se. So it's not like you threw out the entire old way of doing things and started over from scratch. And it seems to me more like it was this recommitment to this culture and this systematic way of running and improving our businesses. And one of the things you guys did to sort of kick that off was this CEO Kaizen. And I'm going to ask you to kind of explain what a CEO Kaizen is before you kind of get into the impact of it. But why was that moment, you believe, the moment that changed everything? So if you explain what is a CEO Kaizen, and then why was that the catalyst that sort of changed the trajectory of EBS inside the organization?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we had done one CEO Kaizen as Envista. And so let me go back and talk about what a CEO Kaizen for our organization looks like. So a CEO Kaizen for us is something that we would do annually or biannually or some version of that looks at the organization across all opcos, all functions, and globally. And so, hey, what are the 5, 6, 7, 8 top priorities or business issues that we want to tackle from an organization perspective? It could be something as simple or something as complicated as, hey, we want to launch our Spark business in Japan. So it's a big initiative. We want to get our aligners in our Japanese market. That could be considered a CEO Kaizen. What's our value proposition? What's our go-to-market? And really get that team together along with other participants to drive that action. It could be something around our people, right? Which is, hey, how do we drive engagement? Our engagement scores over the last couple of years were either flat or slightly down. How do we improve our engagement about our associates? And so it goes back to the priorities that Paul had set going into 2024 and 2025, which is around our quote unquote, growth, operations, and people, right? So we focus our Kaizens to support that three initiatives and really kind of set the stage that says, hey, these are the biggest priorities that we want to tackle this year. This is our stake in the ground. These are the things that we really want to spend our time. And that's the communication that we send out to the organization. What do I love about a CEO Kaizen, if you want to call it that, and maybe it's not the same for everybody, but to me it really drives energy across the organization, right? Meaning the whole company looks at it, hey, we have a time and place that we're running this event. We put our executive leaders in there, our L1 leaders are part of those Kaizen. So as we are doing pre-work and we talk about some of the work and things like that, our executive leaders are in those calls. They're in front of the mic. They have to face the music to Paul and the CEO and the leadership group. So it is a great forum where the whole organization can see that we are trying to drive change across the organization. And as part of that, our executive leaders, our L1s, are they're just another member of the Kaizen team when we do these CEO Kaizen. So it brings such a great energy within the organization, not only from Paul all the way down to the floor operator, but just across the organization. Even if you're not participating, I think there's a lot of energy that it drives to get the organization rallying around a point in time.
I think you called out an important distinction, and you said that leadership is actually embedded on the team as an equal participant in solving the problem, which to me really changes the game in terms of the quality and the speed in which you can solve business problems, because you have all of the right decision makers in the room and you have a cross-functional team of people that understand the process deeply, and you can make the necessary changes in that week. So it's not a plan to plan. It's a plan that gets executed. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit of the Kaizen process in general, right? Again, it's the same whether it's a CEO Kaizen or President's Kaizen to a certain extent. Our CEO Kaizens are set up so that, we have an executive sponsor of each of the Kaizens, and usually it's an operating company or a functional lead, but they are embedded in that team. They are participating in that Kaizen. We block out that week for them that they're not focusing or working on anything else. And, you may see them sitting right next to you trying to build this spreadsheet or work on this ERP solution or work on some sort of value proposition, just like anybody else in that Kaizen. The value of that is twofold. One is I think, everybody in a Kaizen is equal and they have the same voice, and it sees and it shows the humility of the executive leadership. That's one. The second piece is really as part of that team, they're able to help move barriers out, right? So remove barriers is another way to think about it. Whether there is different voices of opinion and the team needs to make a decision, whether it's operating from a, let's call it the investment perspective, we need to find additional dollars to invest in this project or this capital or something like that. We spend that week where we have everybody focused on solving this biggest problem. And so if we need to make a decision on where we're going to invest money, we'll make the decision that week as part of that Kaizen. So again, that leadership, being there, you can't have it without that executive leader participating and really championing those Kaizens.
You've said something that a lot of leaders overlook. People want to come along, but only if they understand the journey. How did communication actually become your biggest enabler on this journey?
Yeah, no, it's another great question, Damon. I mean, if you think about people in general, right? People want to follow. I mean, but at the same time, they want to follow leaders that help them understand what are we really trying to do. And so, I think a lot of organizations spend a lot of time on what they're doing or what we're trying to do, but maybe a little bit less time around why we're doing what we're doing, right? So as part of that, I think it's important for as an organization to communicate independent of whether the communication comes from the CEO, from myself, other leaders of the organization. If you were to ask anybody in this company, what are three priorities? It would be around growth, operations, and people. And then you could start going down, hey, within growth, what is it that we're focusing our attention around? But that constant communication of what we're focusing on, I think that's an important piece that we continue to do day in and day out of what we want to focus our attention around. The second piece is really around the why. Why are we focusing in these areas? And again, this isn't my example, but I'll use an example, that Paul gives all the time, which is, hey, we in the dental market utilize or we operate in a high gross margin environment. If we can drive the revenue, we can optimize our cost structure, then we have gross margin dollars. We take those margin dollars, we invest it back into the business in high value projects, high value things, whether it's new products, whether it's people, whether it's, automation in our sites. We want to use that money to invest in our organization so that basically we can fund our growth ongoing and ongoing, right? So that's kind of the business model, relatively speaking, and the why we do what we do, why we make certain decisions on where we want to go, why we have to save money here. I think it helps people understand what our mechanism is to fund our growth. And again, I think we continue to communicate that over and over so that people understand not only the what, but the why we do what we do.
Ryan, why do most transformation efforts fail to bring people along emotionally, in your opinion?
I say this again and again, and I'll say it again. I think it comes from really leadership, right? Leadership at the top, leadership in the middle, leadership at the bottom. And leadership, as I've said, it comes in a variety of different formats, in a variety of different ways. Just the little things I think really are important as part of that leadership journey. Being at Gemba, having leadership at our manufacturing sites, walking the floor, talking to our associates, coming by, and seeing how things are going, whether if you're in a functional person at a corporate office or somebody is a line operator. I think that leadership really, really is important. And once you start doing that and you start thinking about what that signifies to those people and to the organization, people want to come along for the journey so that when you start talking about EBS, you're talking about continuous improvement. It's another step to reinforce the message that we're trying to do. So it all starts and I think ends with leadership at every level within the organization. And I think that's one of the major pillars that we are continuing to push in this organization.
You mentioned earlier engagement, and I know that you place a very important emphasis on engagement. To me, engagement is a good indicator of emotional connection to purpose at work. So can you talk through how you guys at Envista use engagement as another KPI, if you will, to determine if the culture is winning? And then what do you guys do about it?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things for us. I mean, we'll do an annual engagement survey, but we do on a quarterly basis. We do what we would call a pulse survey or just a check-in with our associates to understand how things are going. Engagement is multifaceted. It's not just one piece. But it's a high priority for us as an organization. It's our third pillar of growth, operations, and people. And then within the people side, it's really about driving engagement. When you have good engagement as part of the organization, that means people not only care, but people want to do more. People are excited to come to work. People want to drive and be part of that journey. So the engagement score really is a reflection upon how we will continue to perform as an organization moving forward. And I think that's another proxy to think about of engagement scores will help us look at what the future looks like, right? So we want a highly engaged organization. We want them to work and come along the journey together as an organization. We want Envista to be in a fun environment. I mean, we can't forget that, hey, we want not only engaged associates, but we want a fun environment. People want to come into the office and work in. So I think it's a multifaceted approach, but at the same time, it's something that we are hyper focused on improving our engagement and engagement scores, quite frankly.
And if I remember back to my Danaher days, there were some specific questions in the engagement survey around DBS and something to the effect of my company embraces and believes in DBS, my manager embraces and leads through DBS, and I understand and use DBS. Did you guys keep that after the separation, or did you modify the?
No, we still have those. We still have those scores, and quite frankly, the good news is I think those scores continue to be high. And they have not really dropped over time, which is a little bit interesting in my opinion. I think people were always kind of utilizing EBS to a certain extent, even during some of the tougher times. I think the challenge was the events that we were doing probably were not as impactful as we wanted to be. But I don't think the EBS side of people, and if you think about what EBS really is, it's a mindset to drive and make things better, right? I think everybody has that mindset, relatively speaking. It's just making sure we get the best out of everybody to see that and enforce that, right? And so I think we were always doing a job of EBS, but I think the impact that we're doing now is significantly better than what it was several years ago.
In your view, the real problem in Envista was too much work means no work. So at one point you realized something very critical, that the company was working on far too many things, which meant it wasn't really focused on anything. We talked a little bit about that, but I want to go deep into why you believe focus is the hardest discipline in a large organization.
Yeah, I mean, again, focus again is probably, I would say, one of the biggest things that I think we talk about as an organization in terms of how many priorities are too many, how many is enough, and what's the right balance of priorities that we would consider to be, in our minds, we would call it hey, what's our telescope versus our microscope, right? We always want to be thinking about, hey, how do we improve our results on a day in and day out basis? Our telescope lens, if you want to call it that. I'm sorry, our microscope lens, if you want to call it that. What are the things that we're going to drive change in the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? But then our telescope lens, what are our long terms that we want to think about? How do we automate our sites? How do we digitize some of our, our workload? How do we leverage AI to make things easier, quite frankly, and so that we can spend the time to work on more valuable things, right? All of those things come through a lens of short-term and long-term, our telescope and our microscope lens. It's a fine balancing, and I think, I don't know if I can give you a real answer, Damon, of, 5 or 7 or 10. I think, as things get easier, I think then, relatively speaking, based upon things that we have done in the past, I think we are able to tackle more events. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do now, which is, hey, as our growth has been pretty good, it's been stable, it's been growing, we want to tackle some of the bigger issues, right? We want to go after things that maybe we didn't do the last year and a half. So we're able to kind of go through more activities because of the fact that we've become more efficient. As part of that efficiencies, we should be able to do more. I think that's always going to be a challenge of what is too many and how many is too many. But I can't give you a specific answer that says, hey, this is not enough and this is too many. But I think every organization kind of has a bellwether to understand what is really the breaking point for the organization.
And now, a brief word about our podcast sponsor. Lean Focus knows that the most effective way to improve the bottom line is through lean transformation. And although lean is most often associated with manufacturing, Lean Focus successfully applies the principles of lean thinking to new business growth, innovation, supply chain, mergers and acquisitions, human resources, and beyond. To enact lean transformations, Lean Focus uses the proven tools of the Lean Focus Business System, or LBS for short. To begin your journey of transformation, pause this episode and contact a senior-level LBS expert now at leanfocus.com. Now, back to the podcast.
What role does EBS play in narrowing the organization to the critical few? And I think about the toolbox and the processes that you can pull on to help really align the organization on what you're trying to execute.
Yeah, I mean, from an EBS perspective, I would tell you that every large initiative or everything that we work on, we embed EBS. And to use a term that my old mentor once said, we want to build quality into the process. Similar to EBS, we want to build EBS into the process, whether it's driving growth in our emerging market or our Envista markets. We want to leverage or envision EBS as part of that journey to get us there. If we want to improve our factory productivity, that's one of the biggest initiatives that we have for this year, last year, and next year. We want to incorporate not only EBS but the Kaizen funnels and everything else associated with EBS helps us get there from a factory productivity. So I don't think EBS is how do you incorporate EBS? I think EBS is already incorporated in what we do from a priorities perspective. And quite frankly, if EBS isn't incorporated as part of that, it's probably not going to make it as a priority, right? Because it would be just a just do it item that we would either have done, it's on the docket, or something that we would just go do because we know what the problems are. We can go fix it. We don't need to quote unquote, focus our attention to fix that if it's not, that big of an issue. So to me, all of our priorities, I think we have EBS embedded into those processes.
And then if you kind of think about the tools like policy deployment, aimed at executing your strategy, which by definition forces you to decide upon a critical few set of initiatives that you're going to execute against your strategy. Do you kind of view that as one of the enablers of narrowing down inside the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've used policy deployment over the last several years, and quite frankly, we used it going back to the time we spun off from Danaher. If you think about, our Spark initiative that we have, which is our clear aligner business in the orthodontic space, we put out, as part of policy deployment, how do we get this business from zero to, you know, you know, let's call it, $100+ million business, right? Which it is today. How do you do that? If you don't have a roadmap, you don't know what you're going to do. That's really where policy development comes into play. Using an old Danaher term, right? If you think about what daily management is to make sure that the trains run on time. Well, policy deployment, quite frankly, is to build new trains. And for us, that's our tool to build new trains. Or in that format, it's to really drive and say, hey, what is our aligner business going to look like in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? And so we use policy deployment. We focused on where we really wanted to kind of look at from a commercial and operations perspective and utilize that tool to say, these are the things that we're going to work on, but these are the things that we're going to ignore for now, right? And so it really leverages and allows you to basically say no to a lot of things because the data would suggest that's not the priority. We've got other, ideas like that or other ways that we use policy deployment, but that's probably one of the most transparent ones that we've been using for 4 or 5 years, and it's been something that we continue to focus our attention around every year.
There's a moment in every transformation where belief shifts, not intellectually, but operationally. So you've described a realization across Envista as just simply EBS works. What triggered that shift in belief?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I look at it this way. I mean, I'm passionate about EBS. I believe it's not that EBS works. I believe it's that EBS is part of your foundation. It's ingrained who you are. It's not a every single day you pass or you fail. I think it's just more of how you operate. It's your mindset to work and leverage EBS. Is it being tested? Yeah, absolutely. It gets tested all the time. And if it's not being tested, that we're probably not doing the right thing in terms of ensuring that, hey, we've got a solutions for this problem. We got this to do it. Can we look at it something differently than the way we currently do it? But if you think about being tested, if you want to call it that, right? I think that the tools and the processes always come out and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's the reason why we do it the way we do it. So, to me, EBS isn't a, hey, can we do EBS or not do EBS? It's always part of your journey. It's part of who you are and part of this organization. So I think the organization always had that mindset. I think the organization always had that capability. I think it's just bringing it out in people, bringing it out in the organization to say, hey, these are the things that we need to do, and we need to leverage EBS to do it. And so I think there was a kind of, hey, let's go get this thing done. And I think that was the mentality that, we've had for the last year and a half, if you want to call it that.
Why do organizations sometimes need to relearn what they already know?
I think a lot of times, maybe there's a little bit of complacency, maybe there's a little bit of arrogance. I think it's always a function of human nature, quite frankly, probably drives some of that. But to a certain extent, I think you always get reminded. Someone would say you always get tested. But, it doesn't mean just because you have to be reminded that you never understood or learned EBS. It just means sometimes you didn't use it like the way you should have, right? And so to me, I think this is a reiteration of, hey, EBS works. We use EBS as part of our day in, day out fundamentals. Those are the things that's going to help us win. And I think the results, relatively speaking, speak for themselves if you look over time.
You mentioned two words, arrogance and complacency. And or a lot of times I associate those conditions inside of a company that's winning, and they've won consistently year after year after year. So they start to envision or view winning in the marketplace as a given or an entitlement. So they stop doing all the necessary things and working as hard as what got them into this position of winning. And then factors shift, whether it be in the marketplace, competition, or external, or COVID, as you mentioned earlier. And it forces a reset where the things that you were doing no longer are serving you with the same outcomes. And you've sort of forgotten how to use that EBS muscle. So now you have to tap into that EBS muscle to dig yourself out of this hole that you haven't been in for such a long time. Did any of that seem to be the situation in Envista?
I think that's definitely a part of it, right? When things are going well, and again, let me, put this framework behind us, which is, I think coming out of COVID, we had moved into a digital world going into COVID. We came out of COVID, we were saving cash. We were working in a digital environment. The market was going up. So things looked pretty good, especially considering that all things considered, hey, we're actually doing pretty well in this type of environment. I think when the market changed, or we misread some of the market indicators, and we said, hey, the growth is not as much as we want it to be. We started asking, okay, is this a short-term issue? Is this long-term? Is this structurally different? I think those are questions that we were trying to answer, but at the same time, we were looking at, some of the other underlying issues within our business that, quite frankly, maybe we never looked at during, either COVID or coming out of it, because of the fact that things were actually pretty good, right? So, you call that arrogance? Do you call that, complacency? I'm not sure that's the right term. I don't think we were ever that arrogant about anything, or we were ever really that complacent. I think it was just more of, we really didn't work on the things that we needed to work on, whether times were good or times were bad. There were structural problems that we wanted to work on, or we should have been working on, that quite frankly, maybe we just didn't work on, right? So to me, I don't think that was so much arrogance, but I think it was just, the distraction of maybe the market growing faster than what we had planned to do, right? So, I think we kind of, lost our eye on the ball, if you want to call it. But at the same time, I think those were times where maybe we could have focused on other areas to improve our performance. Maybe not on the revenue side or not on the commercial side, but there's other things we could have done either on the functional or the operations side during that time period.
With this relaunch and this recommitment of EBS, you started seeing something powerful. President's Kaizens, functional Kaizens, factory transformations. So it's no longer this program anymore. It's become, again, how the business runs. And we talked about mindset and leadership and tools and culture. So what was the big change at that moment in time, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, we started out our, let's call it a reboot of our EBS journey with our CEO Kaizen. And again, I think as part of the CEO Kaizen, it really started to set the tone for the organization. From there, I think, we started holding what we would call President's Kaizen. So if you look at our business, we are OpCo structured. So we have an implants business, we have a ortho business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those presidents start to run their Kaizens to, again, focus on their biggest challenges and priorities within that business. We also ran some of the functional Kaizens that we had never done before, whether it's a CFO Kaizen, RAQA. So we started doing these events not because, myself or, our CEO Paul has said, hey, these are the things you got to do. I think they saw the power of what these things to transform the culture of the organization, get the teams and get the organization focused during this 1 week around their top priorities. I think it was a powerful, powerful message that they sent as part of running these events, right? So, we did that starting in 2025 as part of the reboot for all of the President's Kaizens. We continue to do that in 2026. We're doing more this year than last year, if you can believe that. Not only all the presidents, but all the functional leaders, want to hold their President's Kaizen, but it's an energizing experience during the week where we get global teams to really drive big changes within this organization. Again, you'd be surprised of how many people get excited about it, and you'd be surprised of who wins these Kaizen events. It's not necessarily the leaders going into it. It's always something different, but it's an energizing week, and it's just fun and exciting to participate in those types of events.
Why is local ownership at the point of impact so essential for scaling lean, in your opinion?
I think local leadership, no matter where it is, I think is super important. And with that local leadership, we want to drive accountability. That's the point of impact. That's Gemba. If you run Kaizens, a lot of these people can come in, and then they're going to leave and they're going to move on to other projects, or they'll go back to corporate. But the local leadership team, they have to drive the sustainment. And sustainment for us is the critical thing that we have to ensure as part of not only these events, but what we're doing as an organization to drive real change, right? So can you do that from 30,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away? Probably not. And that's why we really need to engage the local leadership to do that.
And I think you really have a front row seat, and I appreciate that. Being in a corporate function, and you could envision a scenario where you're going into the business and you're pushing for EBS. Rather, local leadership is pulling corporate into their organization to help solve their problems with EBS. So you can see the sort of the importance and where it's placed has shifted to where the work happens, which to me is more sustainably culturally. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we actually do both things, if you can believe it. And so, at a corporate level, let me walk you through a couple of different scenarios, or a scenario that probably illustrates what we're talking about. As an organization, we're looking at improving our factory productivity globally. So, for us, it's not about driving EBS to improve your factory productivity. It's about, hey, as an OpCo, what are we driving, and how do we drive, quite frankly, our factory productivity? Is it, improvement with our vendors in terms of our procurement organization? Is it improving our processes to, quote unquote, be more efficient? Is it taking out labor because of automation? Is it this? Is it this? Is this? So we start out with really what we want to talk about in terms of our problem. And then from there, we talk about our deployment, or how do we fix, or how do we improve certain parts of it. And that's really where EBS comes into play. I never bring that up, quite frankly. The sites always bring that up. The functions bring that up and say, look, if we're going to improve our procurement, what are we doing here? And the teams will go off and do that. But if we want to improve our productivity at a site in a certain machine, whether it's, let's say, hey, we want to change or reduce our changeover times, right? And say, the sites and the leadership of the sites will say, hey, we really need to run this SMED Kaizen event. We want to reduce our changeover time. And so, getting that for us is pretty simple in terms of like what we're trying to do, because we don't focus and say, hey, we got to do EBS for this initiative. What we say is we start out with the problem and say, this is the problem that we're solving. And once we start going down that road and we start understanding where our Paretos are in terms of where our challenges are, what our root cause is, by definition, they always go back to EBS in terms of some of the tools, some of the process, and some of the challenges to really solve that problem. So for me, the tops down never is an issue for us to enable our sites and organization to do EBS. If you think about our day in and day out processes and improvements, whether it's our sites and our function, that always starts at the bottom in terms of our sites drive and say, hey, we got to do this Kaizen, we got to do this event, we got to do these things to really get our performance up. If they don't have the skill set, or they don't have the people to help facilitate or teach or do that, that's when they call us. We will get involved in that. We'll help them, right? So we're more of an enabler at that point, versus saying, hey, you guys are working on this. Why are you doing this, right? So it's not that way. It's really, we do not only a tops down on certain big initiatives as an organization, but at the bottoms up, we'll also do the same thing where, sites have certain targets that they want to hit. They'll reach out to us and say, hey, how can we engage EBS, or how can we engage the EBS office to support us in our initiative. So to me, it works both ways, and I think it actually works really, really well for us.
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you. One of the success factors, I think, with EBS is this direct tie to outcomes, whether you mentioned factory productivity as an example or cost improvement, but hitting actual concrete targets. But something also is very important, which is much deeper, and that's the cultural impact that EBS has inside the organization. So if you were to identify some leading indicators that tell you that that cultural transformation is real, what would you look for? What would you measure?
Yeah, I'll say this, and I always kind of talk a little bit about this informally with different people. But it's when you go into these meetings and you listen to people's conversations and what they talk about and what they show, you see EBS embedded into some of these discussions. We talk about, hey, what's our current state? And people talking about current state, and they'll show their process map, and they'll show, hey, where are you focusing your attention? They'll show an impact matrix. So the tools somehow become part of the discussion. And so at the end of the day, if you see that in those meetings, you see that in terms of going to Gemba site visits, you know that that culture is getting embedded into each and every one within the organization. To me, I just, that's an exciting part of that. And, again, I'll throw out, certain things during meetings to talk about, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? What's your root cause analysis? Are those really symptoms versus is that a root cause, right? So when you start talking in the EBS language and people understand it and they are able to not only countermeasure what you're asking, but able to describe what they're trying to basically solve their problems, it's really, refreshing. It's really satisfying to listen to that discussion that we have using the EBS language. Not that it's a perfect testament to, hey, are things really going well and embedded within the organization? But when people start talking the language, I think that's a really good first step in saying, hey, we're using EBS to really, solve our problems.
I think it's a great observation because the word choice, in my experience, shifts in terms of the lexicon. So you move from a meeting might sound like this. I think, I feel, in my opinion, trust me, I know the answer. I've done this for 20 years. It's not me, it's the market. We'll get better next month. It's a lot of qualitative word usage. And as you start to go through these processes and a lean transformation and using tools like EBS, your word choice shifts to here's what I found out, here's what I observed, here's what I learned, here's what I didn't expect, here's what I'm going to do next, here's what I hope to learn, here's when I'll get that done by, here's who's doing it, and here's when I'll follow up. It's a much more proactive and productive conversation. And part of the language too is showing the artifacts, which you just mentioned are the tools. So we're talking about current state. It's not just talking about the current state. We're standing around a document or a Gemba that shows the current state, and we're pointing out the observations. So it is a really beautiful thing, and I've been there. And but you can tell really quickly in a matter of minutes if it isn't happening too. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us, one of our fundamentals of fundamental tools is our problem-solving process, or our PSP. At a very simplistic level, right? I think it forces, you or the organization to think about, hey, what problem are we really solving? And the problem can't be this high 30,000-foot view of X, Y, and Z. We force the discussion so that we're narrowing down and saying, hey, what is it, the problem? And then from there, we start talking about, hey, what's your Pareto? And people will say, well, people that are not familiar, what does that mean? But in our organization, everybody should understand, hey, what's our level one Pareto? Meaning, what is our biggest reasons why we're missing that problem, right? What's our biggest target? Where are we missing it? How we're missing it? All of those things come into our PSP forum. We go down into the 5 whys. We go down into what we know versus what we don't know. We go into what we consider to be our Bob Wows. So all of this, what I would call data-driven rigor that we implore as part of our problem solving, if it's not filled out or if it's not, consistent across the board, I think it's very, very easy to look at that and say, well, I'm not sure that you really nailed down really where the problem is. I think there's probably some more work to be done, right? So it's a a blameless culture, but it allows us, the organization, to look at that one problem, put focus on it, and say, does that really make sense? And then how do we really countermeasure? So in our PSP world, in our die world, which is our foundation to drive problem solving, we spend 70% of our time really analyzing and trying to understand really what the problem is and really what the root cause of the problem. Because once you really can define that, then the execution of countermeasures or short-term and long-term solutions becomes relatively easy. But I think a lot of organizations, they spend their time trying to countermeasure symptoms versus trying to get down to root cause and really try to fix, the underlying issue within a business. So, that's one of the biggest things that we push in our organization is to really help us understand, is this really root cause or is this more of a symptom than anything else?
One of the most powerful things I've taken away from what you've said is that Envista is now willing to tackle the problems that we used to avoid. Why is that the ultimate signal of a high-performing organization?
I'll say it before and I'll say it again. I think it really starts with the leadership team, and I think I would give kudos to what we've done in the last let's call it 2 years. Is that I think as an organization and as a leadership team, we're very transparent in terms of what we do, how we operate, what problems that we really want to solve. We would talk and discuss things, but at the same time, I don't think there's any kind of white elephants in the room that says, hey, let's not talk about this. Let's not work on this. I think if it's a meaningful impact to the business, I think anything is on the table. And I think we are able to say, hey, what about this side of it? What about this? And even though it may not be within your area of expertise or business, I think we have the flexibility and we have the transparency to say, hey, we should really think about this, right? And so I think it's a testament to kind of the transparency of the executive team, but more importantly, I think it's that transparency that really goes down within the organization. So once you know and can do that, then I think you can start asking a lot of the tough questions, which is around, hey, why don't we improve this? What about this site? What about this process that maybe historically has been kind of, things that was protected? I think those things probably don't exist over time as long as you start an understanding that transparency really helps that process and that journey, and that's what we've been able to do, quite frankly.
Brian, what stands out to me in your journey is this: you didn't need to discover lean per se, you just needed to recommit to it. So for leaders listening, what's the biggest mistake companies make after they've already tasted success with lean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question for us because we went through that journey and we continue to go that journey, right? If you think about continuous improvement in general, it's not a destination. It's a journey of every single day, every single week, and every single year to get better. So to me, I don't think we ever lose sight of that. What I would tell people would be, hey, when you're in the midst of certain things, I think it's really fruitful to stop, take a time out, if you want to call it that, right? And step back and really understand, hey, what are we doing? What's the organization going through? Where can we really spend our time and focus our attention? And what do we really need to work on? Do we need to work on everything? Chances are you don't, right? And so I think the biggest thing is really identifying where you need to focus your attention around when it's all said and done. Then you go back to your EBS tools, you go back to your tool set, and you go back to toolkits and figure out, hey, these are areas that we can utilize our tools, our processes, our people to really drive that change that the organization is looking for. But I think what happens is when you start getting into the middle of things or during the middle of things, I think sometimes you lose focus. And again, we're all human. We're all humans here, right? We're all people. I think it's much easier said than done. But I think it's spending that time within your process to ensure that you're working on the priorities, independent of, quite frankly, if times are good or times are bad. I think it's what we would call part of our planning process, our strat process. What should we spend our time and focus around? And so, to me, I think that's just as important as an opco or a business. Same thing from a business systems perspective. I think it's important to figure out, hey, what do we want to spend our time? What do we want to work on? And what do we stop doing? I think that is part of the continuous improvement journey that we go through and most organizations should go through.
Well said. Brian, this conversation has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon. I appreciate it.
For everyone listening, the lesson here is simple but brutal. Knowing lean works is not enough. You have to choose it over and over again. If this episode challenged your thinking, share it with a leader who needs to hear it. And as always, stay focused, stay lean.
Thank you for listening to the Lean Focus Podcast with host Damon Baker. Please subscribe to this podcast to be notified when a new episode is available. And please consider leaving a 5-star review to support our guests while helping us to spread the word about the power of lean thinking. Until next time.